In December 1941, American pilots rose into the Pacific air with a confidence built long before the war found them. Training had taught them that altitude was safety, speed was freedom, and experience was decisive. The sky, they believed, followed rules written in manuals, rehearsed in exercises, and proven in earlier wars. Those beliefs lasted until the first enemy fighters appeared on their wings. The encounters were sudden and deeply unsettling. A pale aircraft slipped into view, turned tighter than any machine Americans had faced, and cut across their flight paths as if gravity itself had been negotiated away. Pilots pulled into evasive turns and felt their aircraft resist, heavy, slow to respond, bound by limits the enemy did not seem to share. What should have been an escape became a narrowing circle. Men with hundreds of logged hours found themselves outmaneuvered by opponents who had flown far less. This was not humiliation born of error, but of mismatch. The Japanese fighter did not win through speed alone. It won through position. It appeared where it should not have been, stayed where it could not be challenged, and left American pilots reacting instead of deciding. Radio transmissions captured the moment understanding failed. Confident calls dissolved into confusion. Voices asked how the enemy could still be there. Others broke off mid-sentence. Then frequencies went quiet, not gradually, but abruptly. Aircraft that should have disengaged never did. They simply disappeared from the fight. Those who survived struggled to explain what they had faced. They did not describe an aircraft that outran them. They described one that denied distance itself. "It wasn't faster," one pilot later said. "You just couldn't get away." The enemy fighter felt less like a machine and more like a closed door in the sky. On the ground, U.S. Navy intelligence officers sifted through reports that read like contradictions, ranges that defied estimates, turns that ignored aerodynamic theory. An aircraft that seemed to trade protection for something far more dangerous: control. The numbers did not add up, but the losses did. By the end of that winter, the Pacific sky no longer felt neutral or familiar. It had become contested territory, unforgiving, unpredictable, and hostile. And as the wreckage sank beneath the waves, one question lingered unanswered. What kind of aircraft had rewritten the rules so completely, and why had no one seen it coming? The aircraft that stunned American pilots had not been born from accident or desperation. It was the product of deliberate choice. Japanese engineers working in the late 1930s were given a clear mandate: build a fighter that could fly farther, turn tighter, and strike first, no matter the cost. Every kilogram saved was a victory. Every compromise accepted was intentional. To achieve this, protection was stripped away piece by piece. Armor plating was removed. Self-sealing fuel tanks were rejected. Pilot survivability was discussed, then deprioritized. What remained was a machine of extraordinary lightness, its frame thin, its wings wide, its controls almost effortless. In flight, it responded not with resistance, but with obedience. The aircraft did not merely carry the pilot, it amplified him. This design reflected more than engineering preference, it echoed doctrine. Pre-war Japanese naval aviation prized aggression, initiative, and decisive offense. The belief was simple and deeply held. The best defense was never being hit. Victory would come from striking first, turning inside the enemy, and ending the fight before vulnerability mattered. Survival, in this calculus, was a secondary concern. Across the Pacific, American observers drew the wrong conclusions. Reports described the enemy fighter as lightly built, underprotected, even fragile. In another context, these would have been fatal flaws. Analysts assumed such an aircraft could not endure sustained combat. They mistook absence of armor for absence of strength, and lightness for weakness. Combat erased those assumptions quickly. Fragility did not matter if the aircraft controlled the engagement. Protection was irrelevant if the enemy never achieved a firing solution. The fighter's range allowed it to appear unexpectedly, Its agility allowed it to remain untouchable, and its firepower ensured that brief opportunities were enough. Slowly, uneasily, a realization took hold within the U.S. Navy. This was not merely a superior airplane exploiting early war surprise. It was the physical expression of a belief system, one that had traded endurance for dominance and accepted risk as doctrine. America was not just fighting a machine in the sky, it was fighting an idea. And ideas, once proven deadly, demanded an answer that doctrine alone could not provide. By early 1942, patterns were no longer deniable. Engagement after engagement across the Pacific produced the same result. American aircraft failed to return, while Japanese fighters did. Kill ratios tilted sharply, then alarmingly, in one direction. What had begun as isolated shock hardened into data. The air war was being lost, not in theory, but in numbers. U.S. pilots adapted instinctively, abandoning turning fights the moment enemy aircraft appeared on their tails. They dove, they split, they tried to disengage using speed and altitude, techniques drilled into them as safeguards. But the realization came too late. The Zero followed effortlessly, bleeding speed without consequence, remaining close when distance was supposed to save lives. Experience offered no immunity when the geometry itself was wrong. Losses mounted faster than aircraft could be replaced. In the opening months of 1942, squadrons were depleted not by single catastrophic battles, but by attrition. One aircraft here, another there, each loss quietly recorded. The arithmetic was unforgiving. Pilots required months to train. Machines took time to build. The enemy was destroying both faster than the system could respond. Inside briefing rooms and training commands, doctrine began to fracture. Manuals that had gone unquestioned for years were read again, this time with unease. Marginal notes appeared. Certain maneuvers were discouraged, then quietly removed. No announcements were made, no admissions offered. But the confidence that had shaped American air combat thinking began to erode page by page. Senior officers confronted an unspoken conclusion. The fighters they had sent into combat, reliable, balanced, familiar, were no longer competitive. This was not a failure of courage or discipline. It was obsolescence, a word rarely spoken in wartime and almost never applied to one's own forces. Yet the evidence hovered at 20,000 feet, undeniable and lethal. Among pilots, morale thinned. Stories circulated of an enemy aircraft that could not be outflown, could not be outturned, could not be escaped. The word invincible crept into conversations, then spread. It was not belief that threatened the force. It was doubt. The war was demanding an answer. But as the losses accumulated and the sky grew more dangerous by the week, one truth remained painfully clear. No solution yet existed. And until it did, every climb into the Pacific air carried the same quiet question. How long could this continue? In the months after the first defeats, American planners searched for reassurance in what they knew best. Aircraft could be improved later, they reasoned. For now, training would suffice. U.S. pilots were among the most thoroughly prepared in the world, disciplined, technically literate, confident in their craft. Experience, it was believed, would compensate for any temporary disadvantage in design. Veteran aviators were given a quiet burden. They were told, sometimes directly, sometimes by implication, that skill would bridge the gap. That judgment, timing, and courage could overcome lighter wings and tighter turns. In briefings and ready rooms, the message was consistent. Fly better, think faster, trust your instincts. The aircraft would follow. Those instincts, however, had been shaped by an earlier era. Early tactics leaned toward the dogfight, the turning engagement where pilot ability could be measured and proven. It was a familiar contest, one that rewarded finesse and confidence. It was also exactly the fight the Zero had been built to win. Each engagement reinforced the same cruel lesson. Mastery meant little when the rules themselves favored the enemy. Behind the front lines, American industry remained confident. The nation's factories had not yet reached full wartime rhythm, and there was little appetite for abandoning existing designs. Radical innovation carried risk, delays, retooling, uncertainty. Better to refine what already existed. Better to trust that production scale and pilot quality would eventually restore balance. Doctrine filled the gap left by doubt. Combat reports arrived from the Pacific describing losses, patterns, and failed engagements. They were read, summarized, and filed. But doctrine, once written, has gravity. It resists change. Faith in established methods replaced the uncomfortable evidence accumulating in the field. What could not be easily explained was postponed. Meanwhile, the losses continued. Squadrons rotated through combat faster than lessons could be absorbed. Leadership debated causes and solutions in measured language, careful not to undermine morale or admit miscalculation. Each discussion bought time. Each delay carried a cost paid in aircraft and lives. This was not ignorance. It was belief hardened into certainty. The conviction that experience, discipline, and industrial might would inevitably prevail. Just not yet. Arrogance did not announce itself loudly. It worked quietly, reassuring those who held it that patience was wisdom. But time was the one resource the United States could not afford to waste. The sky was already giving its verdict. And as confidence lingered in planning rooms, the question grew sharper at altitude. How many pilots would be lost before belief finally yielded to necessity? Before the war, American fighter design had been guided by moderation. Aircraft were built to do everything reasonably well, to climb, to dive, to turn, to absorb punishment. Balance was treated as virtue. Specialization, by contrast, was viewed with suspicion. A machine too optimized for one role risked failure in others. This philosophy had worked before. It felt sensible. It also shaped what engineers were unwilling to abandon. Design bureaus clung to formulas that had proven reliable in peacetime trials and limited conflicts. Weight could be added to protect pilots. Structure could be reinforced to survive mistakes. Power could be increased gradually. What was resisted was radical subtraction, the idea that something essential could be removed to gain advantage elsewhere. Proven methods have gravity, and they pulled decision-makers back toward the familiar. Naval aviation doctrine mirrored this conservatism. The dogfight remained central, almost sacred. It was where training, skill, and nerve intersected. The decisive moment, planners believed, would always come in a turning contest where the better pilot prevailed. This assumption shaped tactics, training syllabi, and expectations in combat. It also ensured that American pilots repeatedly entered the Zero's strongest arena. The Japanese fighter exploited this predictability with quiet efficiency. Each familiar maneuver invited a precise counter. Each standard response created an opening. The Zero did not need to surprise. It needed only to wait. It thrived on patterns, on habits drilled so deeply they felt instinctive. What Americans considered sound technique became a map of vulnerabilities. Japanese pilots learned quickly. They observed how American aircraft entered turns, how they tried to disengage, how long they committed before breaking off. These habits were catalogued, shared, and exploited. Adaptation occurred in real time. On the other side, change moved slowly, filtered through reports, committees, and approvals. The asymmetry was not just in aircraft, it was in learning speed. Warnings accumulated from the field. After-action reports described engagements that followed the same grim arc. Squadrons sent back assessments that spoke of structural disadvantage, not isolated error. The language was careful but persistent. Something fundamental was wrong. The system, not the pilot, was failing. Those warnings were acknowledged. They were circulated. They were discussed. But they were not acted upon with urgency. Familiar thinking offered reassurance. Adjustments could be made, tactics refined, experience accumulated. There was always another sortie, another test, another meeting scheduled weeks ahead. Delay became policy without being declared. Each day brought comfort at the cost of clarity. The trap was not ignorance, it was attachment. And as the Pacific Air War ground on, the question sharpened with every loss. How long could a force afford to learn slowly against an enemy that adapted without hesitation? From the beginning, American assessments of the enemy were shaped by assumptions that reached beyond aircraft specifications. Racial and cultural bias quietly entered threat analysis, framing Japanese pilots and engineers as imitators rather than innovators. It was assumed that discipline could replace creativity, that numbers could replace ingenuity, and that any early success would fade once confronted by American experience and industry. This bias extended directly into evaluations of Japanese engineering. The Zero's performance was acknowledged, but rarely respected. Analysts searched for shortcuts in its design, cheap materials, primitive methods, careless trade-offs. They interpreted lightness as backwardness, range as recklessness. The idea that Japanese engineers had made deliberate, intelligent sacrifices was slow to take hold. Intelligence failures compounded the problem. Incomplete data, fragmented reports, and limited technical insight reinforced existing beliefs rather than challenging them. Each engagement was filtered through expectations already formed. If the Zero dominated, it must be situational. If it surprised, it must be temporary. False confidence fed on itself, sustained not by evidence, but by familiarity. The aircraft was increasingly labeled a one-trick machine. Agile, yes, but fragile. Dangerous in a turn, but helpless elsewhere. This narrative was comforting. It suggested that the problem could be solved through minor adjustments rather than fundamental change. It implied that the enemy's advantage was narrow and would collapse under pressure. It was a story Americans wanted to believe. Meanwhile, Japanese doctrine did not remain static. Pilots refined their tactics, coordinated their attacks, and adapted to emerging American responses. Lessons were gathered quickly and applied without ceremony. What worked was kept. What failed was discarded. Evolution occurred in the air, not on paper. The enemy was not waiting to be overtaken by time. American pilots paid the price for this misreading. They entered combat with incomplete understanding, facing an opponent whose capabilities had been underestimated and whose learning curve was steeper than anticipated. Each loss was not just a tactical failure, but a confirmation of strategic blindness. Men died not because they lacked courage, but because they had been sent into a fight framed incorrectly. The miscalculation ran deeper than hardware. It was a failure to recognize intent. The Zero was not designed to survive a long war. It was designed to dominate the opening phase decisively. That purpose had been misunderstood, and by the time clarity emerged, the cost had already been paid in aircraft scattered across the ocean floor. Correction, when it came, would not arrive gently. It would require humility, an admission that the enemy had been misjudged in both skill and intellect. And it would require loss, because wars rarely allow learning without consequence. As the Pacific Air War pressed on, the United States faced a sobering truth. Understanding the enemy would take more than observation. It would take blood. The first real adaptations did not come from doctrine or design bureaus. They came from those who survived. Pilots who returned from combat began talking, first in fragments, then in patterns. They compared notes in ready rooms, over hastily drawn sketches, and during long nights when sleep refused to come. These lessons were not theoretical. They were paid for in aircraft left burning on the sea. A simple rule emerged from experience rather than instruction. Do not turn. Dive instead. Altitude, once treated as a shield, became a weapon. Speed was conserved, not traded. Pilots learned to pass through the fight rather than remain inside it. Engagements grew shorter, sharper, and less personal. Survival depended on resisting instinct and trusting physics. This shift marked a deeper change. Energy fighting replaced reflex. American pilots began to think in terms of momentum, of potential energy converted into escape or advantage. Altitude was no longer a starting point for maneuvering, but a reserve to be spent carefully. The Zero could still turn tighter, but it could not follow forever in a steep dive without surrendering control. For the first time, there was a crack in its dominance. One tactic, born from this thinking, spread rapidly: the thatch weave. Two aircraft flew in loose formation, each covering the other's blind spot. When attacked, they turned toward one another, forcing the enemy to choose. Any Zero that committed to one fighter exposed itself to the other. The maneuver was simple, repeatable, and brutally effective when executed correctly. It did not guarantee victory, but it offered something rarer: a chance. Losses began to stabilize, not disappear, but slow. Squadrons that adopted these methods reported higher survival rates. Pilots returned with damaged aircraft and empty ammunition belts instead of not returning at all. The Zero was no longer untouchable, but it was still dangerous. Every success felt conditional, dependent on discipline and timing. One mistake still meant death. Crucially, these tactics did not solve the underlying imbalance. They mitigated it. The Zero still dictated the terms of engagement when conditions favored it. In prolonged encounters, in low-altitude fights, or when surprise was lost, its advantages reasserted themselves. American pilots could now survive, but survival was not supremacy. The burden of adaptation fell heavily on individuals. Training pipelines struggled to integrate new tactics quickly enough. Veterans tried to pass on hard-earned knowledge to replacements who would be tested immediately. Learning occurred under fire. Each improvement arrived only after someone proved, often fatally, what did not work. What these tactics provided was time. Time measured not in months, but in sorties. Time for squadrons to remain intact long enough to learn. Time for commanders to see patterns instead of anomalies. And most importantly, time for engineers to receive clearer feedback from the sky. The air war entered an uneasy pause. The Zero remained superior in the turn. American fighters remained vulnerable. But the margin had narrowed just enough to keep the fight from collapsing entirely. Tactical innovation had stemmed the bleeding, but it could not end it. Somewhere beyond the flight decks and briefing rooms, another effort was underway. One that did not rely on maneuver alone. One that aimed not to survive the Zero, but to replace the conditions that allowed it to dominate. And when that effort reached the sky, tactics would no longer be the only answer. The response that tactics alone could not provide began to form far from the Pacific sky. It took shape in factories, design offices, and testing fields, places where combat reports were no longer abstract documents, but urgent instructions. When Grumman engineers received feedback from the front, it was not softened. Pilots described where aircraft failed, how they died, and what moments decided survival. The language was blunt because the stakes were no longer theoretical. One conclusion cut through every discussion: survivability could no longer be treated as a compromise. It had to be a requirement. Armor was not excess weight. It was time. Self-sealing fuel tanks were not insurance. They were the difference between returning and burning. The new fighter would be built to absorb punishment, to forgive mistakes, and to keep flying long enough for the pilot to make another decision. Elegance was set aside. Power became central. Larger engines were selected not for refinement, but for margin. Margin to climb faster, to dive harder, to escape when necessary. Firepower increased accordingly. The goal was not prolonged maneuver, but decisive contact. If an engagement occurred, it would be brief, violent, and final. This marked a fundamental shift in priorities. Turning radius, once a defining measure of fighter quality, fell down the list. Speed and climb replaced it. Altitude was reclaimed as advantage, not vulnerability. The new aircraft would dictate when a fight began and when it ended. It would refuse engagements it could not win. Control, not agility, became the objective. As designs evolved, the aircraft grew heavier. Every added plate, every reinforced joint, Every additional gun contributed to mass. But that weight brought strength. Structure replaced delicacy. Redundancy replaced fragility. The aircraft no longer relied on never being hit. It assumed that it would be, and planned accordingly. Crucially, pilots were brought into the process early and often. They were no longer treated as end users handed a finished machine. They became collaborators. Their experiences shaped cockpit layout, visibility, control forces, and damage tolerance. Engineers listened not for preference but for patterns. Where pilots hesitated, structure was added. Where they pushed limits, performance was expanded. What emerged was not just a new aircraft, but a new philosophy. One that accepted human limitation as a design condition rather than a flaw. The fighter was built around the assumption that pilots would tire, misjudge, and err. The machine's task was to keep them alive long enough to recover. This approach stood in quiet contrast to the Zero's origins. Where Japanese engineers had optimized for the opening strike, American designers prepared for the long war. Where lightness had been weaponized, resilience was now engineered. The aircraft was not meant to be graceful, it was meant to endure. Steel replaced theory, rivets replaced debate. As prototypes took shape, they reflected the hard lessons of the Pacific, not as refinements, but as corrections. The airframe carried the memory of lost pilots in its reinforced bulk and overpowered climb. By the time the first production models neared completion, the design no longer sought to match the enemy's strengths. It aimed to render them irrelevant. The industry had entered the war with clarity forged by loss. And soon the sky would test whether this new philosophy could do what tactics alone could not, seize control back from an aircraft built to dominate the first moments and outlast it entirely. American engineers were building their answer to the Zero without ever touching one. No intact aircraft sat in a hangar. No wings were measured. No fuel tanks dissected. What they knew came secondhand, from pilots who had survived seconds of chaos, from wreckage glimpsed briefly before it vanished into the sea. The enemy fighter existed more as behavior than as blueprint. It was a ghost defined by what it did, not by how it was built. This absence forced a different kind of design process. Assumptions could not be validated in laboratories. They were tested in combat, where errors carried final consequences. Each sortie returned new fragments of understanding: how long the Zero could sustain a climb, how quickly it bled speed in a dive, how it behaved when pushed beyond comfort. These insights arrived slowly and unevenly, written in loss reports rather than equations. Engineers began to think probabilistically. They did not ask how to defeat the Zero in ideal conditions. They asked how often it could be forced into disadvantage. Simulations were built around ranges of performance rather than certainties. Wind tunnels and calculations explored envelopes of speed, altitude, and structural stress. The goal was not symmetry, but asymmetry, finding the places where the enemy's strengths turned brittle. What emerged was a design philosophy shaped by error tolerance. The new fighter would assume mistakes not as anomalies, but as inevitabilities. Pilots would misjudge closure rates. They would overcommit. They would lose situational awareness. The aircraft had to survive those moments. Strength was not an accessory. It was the core feature. This acceptance marked a quiet reversal of earlier thinking. The Zero had been built to avoid error by demanding precision. Its lightness rewarded perfect flying and punished deviation. The American approach inverted that logic. Precision was desirable, but forgiveness was essential. Armor, redundancy, and structural resilience were integrated not to protect recklessness, but to preserve experience. Crucially, the designers did not attempt to outturn the Zero. That contest had already been settled. No amount of incremental improvement would overcome the physics of weight and wing loading. Instead, they abandoned the premise entirely. Turning performance was capped, acknowledged, and then deprioritized. The aircraft was never meant to win that fight. What it was meant to do was control time. To arrive with excess energy. To strike once with overwhelming force. to disengage before the enemy could respond. The design emphasized climb rate, dive speed, and roll authority, attributes that shaped when and how an engagement occurred. The aircraft would not dance with the Zero. It would interrupt it. Firepower reflected this intent. Guns were grouped for convergence, optimized for brief firing windows rather than sustained tracking. When a shot presented itself, it had to count. This was not finesse. It was finality. The goal was to end engagements quickly before the Zero's agility could reassert itself. Every choice acknowledged uncertainty. Engineers knew they were still guessing at the margins. But they also understood something deeper: perfection was not required. Advantage was. The fighter only needed to shift the balance enough that tactics could become reliable instead of desperate. Enough that pilots could fight with options rather than hope. In this sense, the Zero's absence became instructive. It forced designers to think in outcomes rather than comparisons. They were not chasing an enemy aircraft. They were building a solution to a problem defined by loss rates and survivability curves. The ghost in the sky shaped the machine without ever being seen. By the time the design stabilized, it carried no illusion of elegance. It was blunt in purpose, heavy with intent. Every line reflected a refusal to repeat the early war's mistakes. The aircraft did not promise invincibility. It promised margin. Soon, that promise would be tested, not in simulations or reports, but in the same airspace where confidence had once collapsed. And for the first time since the war began, the question would no longer be whether American pilots could survive the Zero. It would be whether the Zero could survive them. In 1943, without ceremony or announcement, the balance in the Pacific Air War began to shift. A new fighter reached the fleet, not as a symbol, not as a promise, but as a replacement. The F-6F Hellcat arrived quietly on carrier decks already worn by loss, its bulk immediately noticeable, its proportions unmistakably different from what had come before. It did not look elegant. It looked deliberate. The pilots assigned to it were often young. Newly winged ensigns, some with barely enough flight hours to feel confident, climbed into cockpits that still smelled of fresh paint and oil. This was not an elite cadre. It was a generation being rushed forward by necessity. In earlier phases of the war, such inexperience would have been fatal. Now, the machine beneath them was expected to compensate. Across the sky, Japanese veterans prepared for familiar outcomes. They had seen American fighters before, had learned their limits, exploited their habits, and survived long enough to trust their advantage. A new aircraft did not automatically signal danger. Doctrine suggested the same fight would repeat itself. Experience reinforced that belief. The first encounters challenged it. Hellcats returned from combat with holes torn through their wings, scorched fuselages, and damaged control surfaces, and landed anyway. Aircraft that should have been lost kept flying. Pilots who should have died stayed in a fight long enough to disengage. Survivability was no longer theoretical. It was visible, undeniable, and immediate. Firepower changed the rhythm of engagement. When the Hellcat gained a firing position, the encounter ended quickly. Fragile opponents could not absorb sustained hits. What had once required prolonged tracking now resolved in seconds. The Zero's lightness, once its defining strength, became a liability under concentrated fire. Agility mattered less when there was no second chance. Loss ratios began to change, not gradually, but decisively. Where American squadrons had once measured success in survival, they now measured it in returns. Sorties that would have ended in silence now ended in debriefs. Japanese pilots, accustomed to dictating the flow of battle, found themselves reacting instead of initiating. Control shifted without announcement. The most consequential change was psychological. Young American pilots discovered that mistakes were no longer automatically fatal. A misjudged dive, a late break, a poorly timed engagement, these errors could be survived. Confidence followed, not as bravado, but as steadiness. They fought less to escape and more to decide outcomes. Among Japanese veterans, disbelief took hold. The familiar geometry no longer worked. turning inside the enemy no longer guaranteed advantage. Fights that should have been won were abruptly lost. And the losses, once absorbed by experience, now cut deeper. Veterans could not be replaced easily. Training pipelines strained. Each aircraft lost carried a weight that no longer dispersed evenly. Quietly, a nickname began to circulate. It was not official, and it was not flattering. The new American fighter, flown in large numbers by inexperienced pilots, was earning victories that should not have been possible. It was eliminating ensigns, Japanese ensigns, junior pilots who now faced an aircraft that gave no quarter. The name spread in fragments, passed between briefings and reports Ensign Eliminator. It was not a boast. It was an acknowledgement. The war had entered a new phase, one where the quality of the machine reshaped the meaning of experience. Skill still mattered. Courage still mattered. But they no longer carried the burden alone. For the first time since 1941, American pilots entered the Pacific sky with an aircraft that did not demand perfection. It demanded only that they fight. And as the Hellcat's presence multiplied across the fleet, one truth became unavoidable: the Zero was no longer dictating the terms. The turning point had arrived, not with a single battle, but with a quiet reversal that spread from deck to deck. And as the numbers accumulated, the sky itself began to take sides. The transformation in the Pacific Air War did not arrive as a declaration. It arrived as a pattern. Engagements began to follow a different logic, one governed less by instinct and more by energy. Speed, altitude, and dive capability reshaped the geometry of combat. The sky, once fluid and uncertain, began to harden around new rules. Hellcat pilots learned quickly what their aircraft allowed them to do. They climbed above the fight and stayed there. They chose when to descend, when to strike, and when to leave. Engagements were no longer entered by chance or surprise. They were initiated deliberately. Altitude became authority, and speed became permission. This control changed everything. The Hellcat did not linger. It passed through the battle with intent, converting height into velocity, velocity into position. When the attack failed to connect, pilots disengaged cleanly, climbing back into safety. The Zero could follow only briefly. Its strength, tight turning at low speed, offered no answer to an enemy that refused to stay. As this pattern repeated, Japanese losses began to outpace replacement. Aircraft could be built, but pilots could not be grown quickly. Each engagement removed not just a machine, but experience accumulated over years. The balance that had once favored Japanese veterans now worked against them. Survival, once routine, became uncertain. The losses cut deepest among the aces. These were men who had mastered the Zero in its moment of supremacy, who understood its limits and exploited its advantages instinctively. But the new fight offered them fewer opportunities. Skill mattered less when denied proximity. One mistake, one misjudged dive, one overextended pursuit, and the engagement ended decisively. Veteran pilots disappeared from rosters, not gradually, but suddenly. Japanese training pipelines strained under the pressure. Fuel shortages limited flight hours. Instructors were pulled forward to replace losses. New pilots arrived at the front with fewer hours and less preparation, facing an enemy whose aircraft compensated for inexperience rather than punishing it. The asymmetry widened with each month. In this new environment, the Zero's defining strengths inverted. Its lightness made it vulnerable under concentrated fire. Its turning ability trapped it in engagements it could not disengage from vertically. What had once been dominance now imposed commitment. The aircraft excelled in a kind of fight that was no longer being offered. There was no single battle that marked this transition. No announcement that superiority had changed hands. It revealed itself in statistics, in after-action reports, in the quiet confidence of pilots who returned consistently. Superiority shifted not with celebration, but with repetition. It became routine. American squadrons began planning with expectation rather than hope. Missions were flown assuming control of altitude. Losses were anticipated but contained. The chaos that had defined early encounters gave way to structure. The air war became less personal and more procedural. Physics, not daring, dictated outcomes. For Japanese pilots still flying, the sky grew hostile in a new way. Where once it had rewarded boldness, it now punished persistence. The familiar dance of maneuver was replaced by brief, violent encounters that offered little chance to recover. The war in the air lost its rhythm. By late 1943 and into 1944, the verdict was no longer debated. The Zero had not become useless, but it had been outpaced by circumstance. The battlefield it had been built to dominate no longer existed. Superiority had shifted not because one side fought harder, but because one side aligned its machines with reality. There was no ceremony when this happened. No final duel to signal the end of an era. The sky simply began to behave differently. And in that quiet change, the fate of the Pacific Air War was decided long before the last Zero ever fell from it. By 1944, the decisive factor in the Pacific Air War no longer lived solely in the cockpit. It lived on factory floors thousands of miles from the front. American industry, now fully mobilized, was producing aircraft at a scale that redefined what air superiority meant. The Hellcat was no longer a promising solution, it was a constant presence, arriving faster than losses could remove it. Production numbers told a story that tactics could not alter. New Hellcats rolled off assembly lines in volumes that overwhelmed any attempt at parity. Squadrons replenished quickly. Entire air groups rotated through carriers with fresh aircraft waiting behind them. The sky began to reflect this abundance. Where once every loss had been felt sharply, replacements now appeared with mechanical regularity. Japan could not match this pace. Its industry, constrained by resources, bombing, and geography, struggled to respond. Adjustments to aircraft design came slowly, if at all. New variants arrived too late and in too few numbers to matter. Each improvement faced an enemy that had already moved beyond it. Adaptation lagged behind production. As Hellcats multiplied, experience became less decisive than presence. American squadrons no longer depended on a small corps of veterans to carry the fight. New pilots arrived continuously, flying aircraft designed to protect them long enough to learn. Losses still occurred, but they no longer hollowed out units. Experience was preserved through survivability and reinforced through numbers. On the Japanese side, the opposite occurred. Fuel shortages reduced flight hours. Training programs shortened. Pilots reached the front with fewer hours and less preparation, flying aircraft whose advantages demanded precision they had not yet developed. The Zero, once forgiving in the hands of experts, became unforgiving when flown by novices. The air war shifted into arithmetic. Engagements were tallied not by stories, but by ratios. Sorties flown. Aircraft lost. Pilots replaced, or not. Individual brilliance still appeared, but it no longer shaped outcomes. Even successful engagements could not reverse the larger trend. The weight of numbers pressed down relentlessly. This transformation altered the character of combat. Air battles became less about outmaneuvering an opponent and more about sustaining pressure. Continuous patrols denied the enemy freedom of movement. Interceptions occurred repeatedly, predictably. The sky ceased to be contested space and became controlled space, maintained through volume rather than daring. The Zero's decline was not dramatic. It did not vanish overnight. It continued to fly, continued to fight, continued to claim victories. But its dominance eroded quietly. Each encounter carried less strategic weight. Each success was offset by losses that could not be replaced. The aircraft that had once defined the opening of the war now struggled to influence its direction. For American pilots, the psychological landscape changed as well. Missions were planned with expectation of support, not isolation. The presence of friendly aircraft was assumed. Control of airspace was no longer something to be earned each time, it was maintained continuously. Confidence returned, not as bravado, but as normalcy. This was the moment when air superiority became industrial superiority. The sky belonged not to the most agile aircraft or the most skilled pilot, but to the system that could sustain effort indefinitely. Production lines, not dogfights, determined the outcome. The Zero had been designed to win the first phase of the war, to dominate early, decisively, and at range. It succeeded brilliantly in that role. But it was never built for what followed, a prolonged contest against an enemy that could replace losses faster than lessons were learned. By the time this reality settled in, there was no single decision left to reverse it. The air war had moved beyond tactics and machines into momentum. And momentum, once lost, is rarely regained. The Zero still flew. It still fought. But it no longer shaped the sky. And as American aircraft continued to arrive in steady, unstoppable waves, the conclusion became unavoidable. Dominance had shifted from design to production, and there would be no return from that change. By late 1944, the numbers no longer required interpretation. They spoke with a clarity that silenced argument. Kill ratios in the Pacific had reached levels once thought implausible, 10-to-1 in some engagements, higher in others. These were not isolated anomalies or favorable circumstances. They were sustained results repeated across months of operations. The air war had crossed a threshold from contest to conclusion. The F-6F Hellcat stood at the center of this outcome. It did not inspire poetry, and it was never celebrated for elegance. Yet by the final year of the war, it had accounted for the majority of enemy aircraft destroyed in naval air combat. Its record was not built on singular duels or legendary pilots, but on consistency. Sortie after sortie, it delivered the same result. Reliability replaced drama. One reason lay in survivability. American pilots were no longer expended at the rate of earlier years. Damaged aircraft returned. Wounded pilots lived. Experience accumulated rather than evaporated. Men who might once have been lost on their first engagement now flew dozens of missions. They learned not just how to fight, but how to lead. Squadrons matured instead of dissolving. This preservation of experience compounded over time. Veterans trained newcomers. Tactics stabilized. Mistakes were identified and corrected within units that remained intact long enough to remember them. The air war became institutional rather than individual. Knowledge was retained, refined, and passed forward instead of being buried at sea. For Japan, the opposite dynamic unfolded. Losses reached a point from which recovery was impossible. Veteran pilots, men who had mastered the Zero in its prime, were gone. Their replacements arrived with fewer hours, less fuel, and limited opportunity to learn before combat. Aircraft losses stripped units faster than training pipelines could refill them. Attrition became destiny. Courage did not disappear. Japanese pilots continued to fight with determination, often against overwhelming odds. But courage could not compensate for structural disadvantage. Skill could not overcome physics indefinitely. The war punished imbalance without regard for intent. Bravery remained present, but it no longer influenced outcomes. What became clear was that innovation, not valor, had decided the air war. The Hellcat did not demand perfection. It absorbed error. It allowed human weakness to exist without catastrophic penalty. This philosophy, once dismissed as inelegant, proved decisive. The Zero's design, optimized for the opening phase of conflict, collapsed under prolonged attrition. What had once been advantage became vulnerability. The Zero's philosophy had assumed mastery, that pilots would remain highly trained, engagements would be decisive, and wars would be short. None of these conditions endured. As the conflict stretched on, the aircraft's refusal to forgive mistakes became fatal. Each loss carried greater weight. Each engagement consumed a resource that could not be replaced. The transformation of the sky was not celebrated as a victory. There were no triumphant broadcasts proclaiming air superiority achieved. For American pilots, dominance arrived quietly. Missions were flown with expectation rather than anxiety. Losses were anticipated statistically, not feared existentially. The extraordinary became routine. This lack of romance defined the moment. The air war was no longer a contest of heroes, but a system in motion. Aircraft launched, engaged, returned, and launched again. The sky was controlled not through daring, but through repetition. Success was measured in sustainability. Even the Hellcat's achievements were rarely framed in myth. Pilots respected the machine, trusted it, depended on it, but did not idolize it. It was a tool that worked. And in a war that demanded endurance above all else, that was enough. By the end of 1944, the Zero still flew, but it no longer defined the battlefield. Its presence was acknowledged, but no longer feared. The aircraft that had once dominated the Pacific had been overtaken not by a superior mirror image, but by a different approach to war itself. The sky had been transformed from a place of uncertainty into one of control. Not because the enemy had ceased resisting, but because resistance no longer altered the trajectory. The outcome was embedded in the structure of the conflict, in production, survivability, and learning speed. There was no moment when victory felt complete. No final engagement that closed the book. Instead, superiority settled in gradually, like an accepted fact. Pilots returned from missions knowing what the next day would bring. The unknown had been replaced by predictability. This was victory without romance. No duels etched into legend. No singular turning point to dramatize. Just a steady accumulation of advantage until opposition could no longer meaningfully respond. It was the kind of victory that history recognizes only in retrospect. The Zero had changed the war once, by forcing its enemies to confront their assumptions. The Hellcat changed it again, by proving that wars are not won by brilliance alone, but by systems designed for reality rather than ideal conditions. And as the Pacific Air War moved toward its final phase, one truth remained: the outcome had already been decided, not by courage or sacrifice alone, but by which side had learned how to endure. Triumph arrived quietly. And in that quiet, the war in the air was already over. The story of the Zero did not end when it lost the sky. Its significance outlived its dominance. What it revealed about war, design, and human assumption would echo long after the last engagement faded into history. The aircraft had not failed because it was poorly conceived. It failed because it was conceived too narrowly, optimized for a moment that could not last. Extreme optimization had given the Zero its early supremacy. Range, agility, and responsiveness were pushed to their limits, producing a fighter that rewrote the rules of air combat in 1941. But those gains came with hidden costs. Every kilogram removed narrowed the margin for error. Every sacrifice assumed conditions would remain favorable. When the war changed, the design could not adapt without losing the very qualities that defined it. From this emerged a lesson the world would absorb slowly: survivability is not a luxury. It is a strategic asset. An aircraft that keeps its pilot alive preserves experience, judgment, and continuity. It allows learning to accumulate rather than reset. The Hellcat embodied this principle not by accident, but by intent. It treated human fragility as a constant, not a flaw. This shift represented more than technical correction. It was a philosophical reversal. The Zero had assumed excellence would endure, that pilots would remain highly trained, fuel plentiful, and battles decisive. The American response assumed none of that. It planned for fatigue, error, and attrition. In doing so, it aligned more closely with reality. Doctrine, too, stood exposed. The early Pacific Air War demonstrated how slowly belief yields to evidence. Pre-war assumptions about dogfighting, agility, and skill resisted revision even as losses mounted. Pride delayed adaptation. Manuals outlived their relevance. The war punished this hesitation mercilessly. What ultimately prevailed was not superior courage, but superior willingness to change. Doctrine that evolved survived. Doctrine that calcified did not. This principle applied equally to aircraft, tactics, and institutions. The Zero's design philosophy, brilliant in its opening act, proved brittle when confronted with prolonged conflict. War revealed another uncomfortable truth: rigidity is punished more harshly than weakness. An imperfect system that adapts will outlast a perfect system that cannot. The Hellcat was not flawless. It was simply resilient enough to improve over time. The Zero, by contrast, had little room left to evolve without surrendering its identity. Technology, in this sense, became a mirror of values. Japanese engineers valued precision, initiative, and decisiveness. American engineers valued endurance, redundancy, and forgiveness. Neither approach was inherently superior in isolation. But in a long war of attrition, one set of values aligned better with survival. As the conflict progressed, the air war ceased to be a contest of pilots and became a contest of systems. Engineering cycles replaced individual brilliance as the decisive factor. Production, feedback, iteration, and survivability formed a loop that compounded advantage. The sky was shaped less by daring maneuvers than by design choices made far from the front. These lessons did not end with propellers. They carried forward into the jet age. Post-war aircraft design emphasized energy management, survivability, and systems integration. Redundancy became standard. Pilot protection was prioritized. The assumption that pilots would face overwhelming stress and make mistakes was built into cockpits and airframes alike. Even doctrine changed. Air combat was no longer framed solely as a test of reflex and courage, but as an exercise in managing energy, information, and time. Training emphasized decision-making under pressure rather than flawless execution. The Zero's legacy lived on as a warning: brilliance without margin is fragile. There was irony in this outcome. The Zero had forced its enemies to innovate, adapt, and rethink the nature of air warfare. In doing so, it accelerated changes that ultimately rendered its own philosophy obsolete. What began as an advantage became a catalyst for transformation. History often celebrates the machine that wins. Less often does it reflect on the machine that taught the lesson. The Zero did both. It dominated when others were unprepared, and it failed when the world learned what it revealed. Its story reminds us that war does not reward ideals. It rewards alignment with reality. Designs that assume perfection will one day meet exhaustion. Doctrines that assume short wars will face endurance. Systems that plan for human limitation will outlast those that deny it. In this way, the Zero's true legacy is not found in its victories or defeats, but in the shift it forced upon the world. It showed what was possible and what was unsustainable. It exposed the cost of betting everything on the opening move. By the time jet engines replaced piston engines, the lesson had been absorbed. Aircraft were no longer built solely to win the first engagement. They were built to survive the 1000th sortie. The air war had matured into an engineering discipline grounded in attrition, not idealism. The Zero had taught the world how fragile dominance can be. And the world, having learned, did not forget. What remained was a quieter truth, carried forward into every design review and doctrine debate that followed. That wars are not won by perfection, but by planning for failure. And in the next and final chapter of this story, that lesson would be distilled into a single, enduring irony. The Zero entered the Pacific War like a revelation. In the opening months, it dominated the sky with an authority that seemed absolute. It outranged its enemies, outturned them, and appeared wherever it chose. Against forces still bound to pre-war assumptions, it delivered shock after shock. The early air war bore its signature. Confidence collapsed not because American pilots lacked courage, but because the rules had changed without warning. Those first victories were not accidental. They were the result of clarity. Japanese engineers had built an aircraft precisely for the war they expected: a short, decisive conflict won through initiative, skill, and offensive reach. In that war, the Zero was nearly perfect. It imposed its will quickly and punished hesitation. It won the opening chapter with ruthless efficiency. The Hellcat arrived later, without drama and without illusion. It did not seek to reclaim the romance of air combat. It sought to close the book. Where the Zero defined the beginning of the Pacific Air War, the Hellcat defined its ending not by brilliance, but by persistence. It did not rewrite the rules of flight. It aligned itself with the realities of prolonged conflict. The contrast between the two aircraft revealed a deeper divide. One chased perfection. The Zero was engineered to extract the maximum possible performance from every kilogram, every surface, every control input. It rewarded mastery and punished error. In the hands of experts, it was lethal. But it assumed those experts would always be there. The other embraced reality. The Hellcat was built around the assumption that pilots would be young, tired, inexperienced, and human. It assumed they would misjudge distances, hesitate under fire, and make mistakes under pressure. Its purpose was not to prevent those failures, but to survive them. In that humility lay its strength. The Zero assumed skill would last forever. That training pipelines would remain intact. That fuel would be plentiful. That losses would be limited. None of these assumptions survived the war they encountered. As conditions worsened, the aircraft's brilliance became a burden. Each loss mattered more. Each mistake carried final weight. The Hellcat assumed none of that. It assumed attrition. It assumed exhaustion. It assumed that wars grind down even the best forces over time. And so it was built not for the first battle, but for the 1000th sortie. It planned not for perfection, but for failure, and then planned to endure it. The war rewarded this assumption mercilessly. Men failed, as men always do. Machines broke. Weather intervened. Luck turned. In that environment, systems that demanded flawlessness collapsed. Systems that absorbed error survived. The Hellcat preserved pilots long enough for experience to accumulate. The Zero consumed experience faster than it could be replaced. This was not a judgment on courage. Japanese pilots fought with extraordinary determination long after the strategic balance had turned against them. Nor was it a celebration of inevitability. The outcome was not preordained. It was shaped by choices, by what designers believed about war, about time, and about human limitation. The irony was profound. The Zero had been built to win the first war, the opening phase, the decisive strike, the moment when surprise and initiative mattered most. It succeeded brilliantly in that role. But in doing so, it locked itself into a vision of conflict that could not survive endurance. The Hellcat was built for the war that followed, the war of replacement rates, learning curves, and sustainability. It did not need to dominate immediately. It needed to remain. And by remaining, it reshaped the sky until dominance became routine. By the time the Pacific War neared its end, the contrast was complete. The Zero still flew, but it no longer defined outcomes. The Hellcat no longer surprised, but it no longer needed to. The air war had moved beyond individual contests into systemic control. History often remembers the weapon that arrives first. Less often does it reflect on the one that finishes the job. Yet it is the latter that reveals the deeper truth about conflict. Wars are not won by the most inspired opening move. They are won by the design that survives contact with time. The Zero forced the world to confront its assumptions. The Hellcat forced it to confront reality. Together, they told a story not just about aircraft, but about how nations think under pressure, what they value, what they risk, and what they choose to protect. In the end, the Pacific Air War was decided not by who flew better on a given day, but by who planned more honestly for the long run. One side built for excellence. The other built for endurance. One demanded the impossible from its pilots. The other assumed they would fail and refused to let that failure be final. They built it to win the first battle. It ended up losing the war. And in that quiet conclusion lies the enduring lesson of the sky over the Pacific. That victory belongs not to the machine that dazzles at the beginning, but to the one that remains when the war refuses to end.